Welcome everyone. I'm going to be talking today about the disruption in the Church of Scotland in 1843. But to make sense of this, we'll have to go back in history a wee bit to the 18th century and to just after the Union of 1707, when a law was passed that impacted on the governance of the Church. In addition, I'm hoping some of the resources I'm going to reference will help with your own family history research. Now, in the main, the disruption, as it came to be known, was the accumulation of many years of disagreement over how much influence the state could have over the established Church of Scotland. This quote is taken from the Church of Scotland's own website, and for our talk today, the last sentence here is key. No one person or group within the Church has more influence than any other. Now, since the Reformation, the Church of Scotland has been Calvinist Presbyterian. However, the Church had, until the 19th century, retained certain features of the Catholic Church. One such feature was the parish system of church organisation. Now, in the first half of the 19th century, there were over 900 such parishes, each with its own minister, manse and glebe. This image shows an old manse in the north of Scotland with the surrounding glebe. The glebe could run to about 10 acres, and the minister could either farm the glebe himself or rent the land out. In addition to the house and land, the minister would also receive a salary called a stipend. These costs, along with the upkeep of the church and its graveyard, would be met by a tax on the tithes of the parish. Now a wee bit of how the church was governed. The lowest church court was the parochial kirk session, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. It comprised the parish minister as moderator and at least 2 elders. Its duties included the maintenance of church discipline, the supervision of church ordinances, the administration of the poor law, and the supervision of schools and roads within the parish boundary. These records comprise one of the most important sources for Scottish history from the 16th century until the late 19th century. The next level of the church courts was the presbytery, which had supervision of a number of parishes in a local area. Officially, its members were the minister and 1 elder from each parish within its boundary. This image highlights the parishes in the presbytery of St Andrews. The number of parishes in a presbytery varied greatly, some with as few as 5, some with more than 20. The presbytery acted as the first court of appeal from rulings of the kirk sessions. They also were the court of first instance in matters affecting church buildings, manses, glebes and churchyards. And most importantly for this discussion, they judged presentations to vacant parishes within its boundary area and ordained and inducted new ministers. Now there was a third level of church courts. This was the provincial synod, which supervised the presbyteries within its boundary. The Kirk, the Church of Scotland, did away with this level in the 1990s. And finally, the highest church court was the General Assembly. Its members were representative ministers and elders from each of the presbyteries, together with an elder from each of the universities and the royal boroughs. The General Assembly met in Edinburgh for 2 weeks in May each year. This slide shows the home of the General Assembly, St Andrew's Church on George Street in Edinburgh, both then and now, although the church has changed its name and it's now called St George's. Now I said we'd have to go back to the 18th century, but here we are back in the 16th century at the real crux of the matter. Who appoints the ministers to the kirk? Before, I mentioned the first characteristic the kirk inherited from the Catholic Church was the parish system of church organisation. The second characteristic was lay patronage. Lay patronage first appeared in the 12th century when landowners built churches on their lands and claimed the right to choose the priest to minister there. Now, after the Reformation, John Knox declared, "It appertaineth unto the people and to every several congregation to elect their own minister." However, in 1567, the Scottish Parliament decided that while the examination and admission of ministers was a function of the Church, it was down to the patrons to put forward a candidate. This lasted for 85 years before lay patronage was abolished by the law in 1649. It was then reintroduced in the 1660s. However, after the accession of William and Mary, an act was passed that deprived the lay patrons of their right to present ministers to vacant parishes, and decreed that when a vacancy occurred for a parish minister, the Protestant heritors and elders were to propose a new minister to the congregation for their approval or disapproval. Going into the 18th century, it looked like John Knox's wishes had finally been met. In 1707, we have the Acts of Union, and on the 1st of May 1707, the Scottish Parliament and the English Parliament united to form the Parliament of Great Britain, based in the Palace of Westminster. The Acts of Union guaranteed that the Church of Scotland should continue for all time as at present constituted. Phew, Mr. Knox is still a happy man, no more lay patronage. Well, that didn't last long, and the dispossessed Scottish lay patrons were able to persuade the Parliament of Great Britain that they had unjustly lost a purely civil right. Consequently, the Church Patronage Scotland Act 1712 was passed, restoring to the original owners the right to present suitably qualified candidates to presbyteries in the event of a vacancy. I should point out that patrons did not need to be members of the Church of Scotland, live in the parish, or even be a Scot. About a decade after the passing of the 1712 Act, patrons regularly began to insist on their rights of presentation, and as their demands rose, so did the resistance of certain churchmen, although most ministers were prepared to accept the provision of the Act. While I was looking for an example, the first one I alighted on in the fast date was William Dalrymple, who you can see was licensed by the Presbytery of Ayr on the 2nd of May 1745 and presented by the patron, who in this instance was King George II. It was purely by chance that my example happened to be the minister who baptised Robert Burns. Now, the Church of Scotland had substantial splits in the 18th century. The first of these came about around 1740 when the General Assembly, the highest church court in the land, expelled 4 ministers led by the Minister of Stirling, Ebenezer Erskine, who had made it very clear in a sermon he had preached to the Synod in Perth his opposition to the Patronage Act, calling the Act unscriptural and unconstitutional. This cessation by these 4 ministers led to the formation of the Associate Presbytery and later the United Cessation Church, although as you can see in the pink bubble, they themselves split and regrouped and then regrouped. This was by no means a wee splinter group, as by 1820 the United Cessation Church had over 280 congregations. By the early 1750s, the moderates had established firm control over the General Assembly. Under their regime, any objections to a presentee which members of a congregation might have were increasingly ignored. At the same time, decreased importance was given to the document known as the Call. Many evangelicals and others held that the Call to be a vital part of the induction procedure. According to this view, at least half the parishioners should sign a call before a new minister could be validly inducted. There are instances, where only one or even none of the parishioners signed the call in support of the appointment of a new minister. Now, some ministers objected to taking part in these enforced inductions and began to absent themselves from the presbytery meetings, which were called to intrude a minister to a vacant parish. On some occasions, a presbytery could not carry out an induction because of the lack of a quorum. Following one such incident at Inverkeithing in 1751, Thomas Gillespie, minister of Cranach in Fife, was expelled from the church in 1752. He continued to act as a minister of a small congregation of adherents and with 3 friends founded the Relief Church in 1761. Relief, that is, to patronage and the church courts. The moderate policy of intruding unpopular ministers to vacant charges and disciplining and even deposing other ministers who refused to agree with and carry out that policy caused ministers and laity to leave the established church in increasing numbers. By 1843, the Secession and Relief churches together comprised a total of 510 congregations. The picture on this slide is the Gillespie Memorial Church in Dunfermline. And we'll get to the 1800s, I promise, but before we go there, I'd like to highlight a few resources. The first is the old statistical accounts from the late 1700s. There is one for each of the 900 plus parishes, and they're almost exclusively written by the minister of that parish. I've highlighted this page from the parish of Tannadice because it notes that the patronage of the parish belongs to St Mary's College, St Andrews University, and that one of the popes made a grant of the lands of Tannadice for the erection of that college. So, as well as members of the nobility, patrons of parishes could be a university or a royal borough. Alexander Webster was a minister in Edinburgh who organised the gathering of population data across Scotland in 1755. The ministers in 909 parishes were asked to provide information about the extent of their parish, the number of ministers in the parish, the number of Roman Catholics and Protestants, the total number of inhabitants, the number of fighting men, those were men between the ages of 18 and 56, and the age of the inhabitants. On this page here, from the analysis, we're interested in the return from Paisley, which shows that at that time it had a population of under 7,000 and a total of 5 ministers. Jumping ahead to 1825, we can see in Pigot's directory that Paisley, now with a population approaching 30,000, has greatly increased the number of places of worship, including 2 relief churches and 2 United Cessation churches. If you look in the directory, you'll see this pattern repeat in many places across Scotland. By 1830, 29% of the Scottish population were Presbyterian dissenters, although in Glasgow that figure is put at around 40% and in Edinburgh 42%. In 1832, Thomas Chambers became the moderator of the General Assembly, and under his leadership, the Evangelical Party in 1934 attained a majority in the General Assembly for the first time in 100 years. One of their actions was to pass the Veto Act, which gave parishioners the right to reject a minister nominated by their patron. The Veto Act was to prevent the intrusion of ministers on unwilling parishioners and to restore the importance of the congregational call. However, it served to polarise positions in the church and set it on a collision course with the government. I'm now going to talk about the 3 most celebrated cases leading to the disruption. In the autumn of 1834, the parish of Achterarder became vacant, and on the 14th of October, Lord Kinnoul, the patron, presented Mr. Robert Young, a preacher of the gospel. The congregation had the opportunity of testing his ministerial qualifications, but their opinions were so adverse that out of a population of 8,000, only 2 individuals, Michael Todd and Peter Clark, signed the call. 5/6 of the congregation, on the other hand, came forward to protest against his settlement. They didn't want the man. The church accordingly found that they could not proceed with his ordination after order, and the patron was requested to make another appointment. Unfortunately, this was not done, and Lord Canule and his presentee resolved to carry the case into the civil courts. The courts decreed that in the settlement of ministers, the church must have no regard to the feelings of the congregation. Mr. Robert Young must be ordained to the post, just as if the refusal of the people had not been given. The case was appealed to the House of Lords, where the pleading was heard in March 1839. The sentence of the Scottish Court of Session was confirmed. The next case that arose was that of Lathendy in Perthshire, where the congregation had vetoed the appointment of a Mr. Clark. The patron, who in this instance was the Crown, then presented another clergyman, Mr. Kesson, who met with the approval of the congregation. But Mr. Clark, on hearing of the second appointment, applied to the Court of Session for an interdict forbidding the presbytery to appoint Mr. Kesson. The presbytery, then acting on advice of the General Assembly of May 1838, went ahead with the appointment of Mr. Kesson in defiance of the Court of Session ruling. For this offence, the members of the presbytery were then summoned to the Court of Session, where they were told they had violated the laws of their country, and that if they or any other clergyman should commit a similar offence, they would be committed to prison. The case of Marnock Parish deserves special attention, and it's one that must have had John Knox buddling in his grave. It was in 1837 that a vacancy occurred, and Mr. Edwards was presented for the post. For 3 years he'd officiated in the church as assistant to the former minister, and the parishioners knew him well, so well that only one man, Peter Taylor, the innkeeper, signed his call, while 6/7 of the congregation actively opposed his settlement. In May 1838 he was set aside by the church, and, as in the former cases, Mr. Edwards appealed to the civil courts, and in June 1839 a decision was given to the same effect as before. No regard was to be made to any opinions or feelings of the parishioners, and he was to be installed as minister. At Marnock, however, a new feature comes into view. Unlike the Lathendy case, the majority of the Strathbogie Presbytery belonged to the moderate party within the church, and they agreed with the civil courts when they ordered the settlement of Mr. Edwards to go forward. The General Assembly, the highest church court, was having none of this and expressively prohibited the Presbytery of Strathbogie from taking any steps towards a settlement of Mr. Edwards. The majority of the Strathbogie Presbytery ignored this instruction and were suspended from their office as ministers of the church and prohibited from all acts ministerial or judicial. After the Marnock case, the Evangelical Party later presented to Parliament a claim, declaration and protest anent the encroachments of the Court of Session. The claim recognised the jurisdiction of the civil courts over the endowments that the government gave the Scottish Church. However, the claim resolved that the Church give up these endowments rather than see the crown rights of the Redeemer, i.e. the spiritual independence of the Church, compromised. This claim was rejected by Parliament in January 1843, leading to the disruption in May of that year. The climax came at St Andrew's Church in Edinburgh on the 18th of May 1843. the first day of the annual General Assembly. After opening prayers, the retiring moderator, the Reverend David Welsh, read out a long statement protesting that the British state had infringed the spiritual independence of the national church in Scotland. When he had finished, he laid the protest on the table and walked into the streets, to be followed en masse by the evangelical leaders of the church and their followers, leaving the left or evangelical side of the church nearly empty. They walked three abreast down Hanover Street, through an unbroken mass of cheering people and beneath innumerable handkerchiefs waving from the windows. At Tanfield Hall, the procession was joined by hundreds of other ministers equally determined to leave the established church. The Assembly then formally constituted itself as the Free Protesting Church of Scotland and signed the Deed of Demission, by which over 450 ministers resigned from the existing establishment and surrendered their churches, houses, and incomes. It was a remarkable demonstration of the power of religious principle and commitment. By 1849, only 6 years after the disruption, the Free Church had erected 730 places of worship, built 400 manses, supported 513 teachers instructing 44,000 children, and founded a college to educate its ministers. Much of this came about through the contributions of the affluent urban middle classes and artisan classes who were the backbone of the Free Church. By 1850 in Dundee, the Free Church had more places of worship than the Established Church of Scotland. Despite this, the Established Church of Scotland continued to attract loyalty, especially in the Borders and the rural lowlands. In 1847, there emerged a third large grouping when the main secession groups from the 1700s, the Relief Church and the United Secession Church, combined to form the United Presbyterian Church, and in Dundee of the 1850s looked to be on equal footing with the Established Church of Scotland and the Free Church. I looked to the fast day to discover the fate of the three ministers involved in the three cases discussed previously. Robert Young was appointed minister of Achterarder in the end and served there until his death in 1865. At Lethendy, Thomas Clark had his licence removed, then reinstated, then he was finally deprived of it in 1846 following charges of drunkenness. Andrew Kesson joined the Free Church in 1843. John Edwards kept his position at Marnock, and the Fasti claims that, quote, by his prudent and conciliatory manners, he won much esteem and affection from many of his parishioners and from those who had been his opponents. He died the 1st of October, 1848. I'm going to end with these three snippets from the new statistical accounts which were published in 1845. None of the ministers involved in the previous cases wrote these accounts, although at least two were in a position to do so. At Achterarder, the writer notes that the stipend for the minister of the Church of Scotland, which would be the Reverend Young, was only £52, while the ministers for the Relief and Secession churches received £115 and £100 respectively, plus they had houses from their congregations. Lethendy makes sad reading as it shows church collections and mortcloths are the only source of support for the poor, while the minister is paid a stipend of about £78 a year. The schoolmaster is only paid about £12. Finally, the author of the Marnock account, who is the Mr. D. Henry mentioned in the text above, writes, Mr. John Edwards was presented by the patron in 1837. Another presentation was issued by the patron in 1838 in favour of Mr. D. Henry. The proceedings that led to the second presentation, or that ensued, need not be recited here. We may merely mention that they led to the erection of a very handsome new church and manse near the village. The church contains about 1,000 bearers and the whole cost more than £2,000. And this is the church that the Reverend David Henry was alluding to. When the Marnock congregation were prevented from choosing its new minister, many walked out and formed a new church in nearby Aberherder. The church opened a year later as a non-intrusion church and subsequently joined with the Free Church when the disruption spread in 1843. A couple of things to end. One, I got interested in the cases for the disruption because as I was doing my family history, I discovered I had a third great-grandmother born in Lethendy and a third great-grandmother born in Marnock. Unfortunately, I haven't found anybody related to me born in Actor Arder. The second thing is most of the resources I've used in this talk today can be found on the webpage listed on the bottom of the slide. Hope you enjoyed the talk. Thanks for listening.